It was a Thursday night, and the air was heavy with the familiar sense of stale beer and sizzling burgers as I stepped into Tom's Tavern. It's one of those neighborhood bars that feels like an old pair of shoes, worn but comfortable. The dim lighting throws odd shadows on the walls, and a neon sign flickers, struggling to maintain its glow. This place has been my refuge whenever I need to unwind. After a grueling day at work, I never encounter much drama here. Until that night. I settled onto my usual stool at the bar and gestured to Tony, the bartender, for my regular lager. We exchanged the customary small talk about the weather and the upcoming football game, and I took in the comfort of the chatter around. It wasn't long before my eyes wandered towards the end of the bar, where a man I'd never seen before sat nursing a whiskey. He had a disheveled look, rumpled clothing and eyes bloodshot, tethering between exhaustion and unease. He was distinctly out of place among the usual patrons. Our accidental eye contact turned into a nod of acknowledgement. He seemed eager to talk, or maybe it was just my imagination. A little over halfway through my beer, he slid over a few stools and introduced himself as David. His voice was raspy, and there was an underlying tension to it, a strange urgency, as if he harbored secrets he was aching to release. We engaged in the obligatory small talk. At first, nothing too unusual. Where are you from? What do you do? That sort of thing. He mentioned he'd recently moved into town due to work. Yet, when the conversation veered towards where he lived, he paused, choosing his words carefully, almost stuttering. It was a subtle break in his demeanor. I thought maybe he was just another guy down on his luck, or maybe going through something tough. David shifted the conversation to my side, peppering me with questions about my life. I didn't mind much. After a few too many trips to the bar, rambling about personal stories becomes easy. But then his questions took a more probing turn. He asked if I lived alone, if I spent my nights at the bar often, and if I had family nearby. Each question made me uneasy, as if he was mapping out more than just a conversation. I became aware that his eyes didn't quite focus on me. They darted around the room, lingering near the entrance and then settling back onto me. Weathered as they were, they held a sharpness, a quiet watchfulness that I couldn't shake off. Something about his vibe shifted. He tentatively asked if I could do him a favor. Catching my hesitance, he hastily added, "Nothing major, just a small thing." Against my better judgment and perhaps feeling that it was impolite to outright refuse, I said, "What is it?" He leaned in closer, and I caught a whiff of whiskey and something else. Sour, like old sweat. "I need you to come with me, just for a bit. It's important." Alarm bells went off in my head. The way he said it, too casual yet demanding, didn't sit right with me. I hesitated before responding, mumbling something akin to, "I'm not sure." David's eyes darkened and he pressed, "I just need someone to have my back. It's not far, please." Trying to extricate myself from the situation, I deflected by saying I had an early morning ahead and should probably head home soon. His pleas intensified into something more desperate, and I knew then I needed to get out. I signaled Tony for the tab, but before he could hand me the check, David whispered abruptly, "You don't understand, it could be dangerous." His eyes had a glimmer of fear now, and I saw his hand tremble as he raised his glass. Dangerous! Now he really lost me. Without saying much, I stood up, deciding to hit the restroom before making my exit. In the quiet of the bathroom, I splashed water on my face, trying to clear my mind and rationalize his odd request. Perhaps I misjudged his intentions. Maybe he was in some sort of trouble, but even weighed against his anxiety, it felt sketchy. As I returned to the bar, I noticed David had shifted again, now closer to another patron. He seemed to be working the same tactic on this one, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Feeling unsettled and borderline annoyed, I paid my tab and made my way to the exit. The crisp night air was a welcome change from the bar's thick atmosphere. As I walked away, I could feel eyes on my back, a prickly sensation that made the hairs stand up at my neck. I turned briefly, catching sight of David standing at the entrance of the bar, watching me, silhouetted by the dim light spilling out into the street. I picked up my pace, wanting to put distance between us quickly. I hadn't gotten far when I heard footsteps behind me, uneven, but gaining. My heart started racing. I turned a corner quickly, hoping it wasn't him, hoping it was all in my head, but the footsteps followed, insistent and closer. The street was emptier than usual, the echoes of my hurried pace punctuating the silence. As I neared a busier intersection, the footsteps ceased. I risked a glance back, only to find no one there. My path homeward became a series of jerky, anxious strides as I kept checking over my shoulder. Only when I reached the safety of my apartment did my pulse begin to calm. That night, I couldn't sleep well. My mind circled around David and his uneasy requests. It wasn't until 3 days later, reading the local news, that the full gravity of my encounter sank in. A man fitting David's description was picked up in relation to a series of home invasions and thefts. The news reported he'd been coercing bar patrons into unsuspecting accomplices or manipulating them for information to plan his next move. The realization hit me hard. Had I gone with him, had I let those fleeting instincts of politeness and sympathy guide me, who knows what part of his scheme I might have unwittingly played a role in. It was chilling to think about. I dodged a bullet that night, and it served as a stark reminder to keep my guard up, to question those that seem off, and most importantly, to trust my gut when something feels dangerously wrong. Since then, I've been more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, and less inclined to engage with strangers over drinks, trusting that instinct of caution that almost saved me from something potentially perilous. It was a Friday night like any other. The air felt cool against my skin as I strolled down the packed street, the dim glow of streetlights casting shadows along the pavement. Noise from nearby bars and restaurants spilled out onto the sidewalk, mixing with the chatter of passers-by and the occasional roar of cars speeding by. After a hectic week at work, I was ready to unwind and catch up with my old college friend, Matt. We had arranged to meet at O'Sullivan's, a cozy bar we both frequented back in the day. Entering O'Sullivan's felt like stepping into a chapter of my past. The place was buzzing, filled with a mix of local regulars and newcomers alike. The faint smell of beer and fries lingered in the air. A live band played a cover of an old classic rock song that I couldn't quite place. I spotted Matt at the bar, waving energetically with a half-empty pint in his hand. "Finally made it!" Matt shouted over the music, flashing his signature grin. "Traffic was a nightmare," I replied, shaking my head but smiling as I pulled up a stool next to him. We quickly fell into conversation, reminiscing about old times and catching up on each other's lives. An hour or so passed in what seemed like minutes. Our laughter mingled with the hum of the crowd and the clinking of glasses. I excused myself to head to the restroom. The hallway leading there was narrow and dimly lit. A subtle unease crept over me, as those kinds of spaces often do, but I brushed it off. As I was coming back, I noticed a group of men at the far corner of the bar. They were animated, voices raised a notch above the background noise, not arguing, but certainly in some heated discussion. I didn't think much of it until Matt nodded over their way when I returned. "They've been at it for a while. Something about sports betting, I think," he said. "People get pretty riled up over those things," I replied, shrugging it off. But something about their intensity nagged at me. We continued our conversation, but my attention kept drifting back to the men in the corner. One of them, tall, muscular, with a buzz cut, seemed especially agitated. His gestures were wild, knocking over an empty glass at one point. Another guy, smaller and wiry, leaned in closer to him, hands out in what seemed to be an attempt to calm the situation. "It's getting a bit rowdy back there," I commented to Matt, my curiosity now fully piqued. Matt glanced over his shoulder, then waved it off. "Doesn't seem too serious," he said, though I could see him keeping an eye on them as well. Almost instinctively, I scanned the room. The bartender, a burly man with a beard that made him look more like a lumberjack than a mixologist, had noticed the growing tension too. He watched them carefully while serving drinks, occasionally glancing their way between orders. Minutes went by, and the group's argument fluctuated in intensity. It was in one of those moments when things appeared to have calmed down that it all escalated sharply. The man with the buzz cut stood up abruptly, his face a mask of anger now, just as the smaller man made an attempt to reach out again. In one fluid and terrifyingly swift motion, the tall man reached into his coat and pulled out a knife. The sight of it was like a trigger, sending a shockwave of panic through the bar. Some people screamed, some ducked instinctively, and others, like Matt and I, were momentarily frozen, our minds scrambling to process what was happening in the split seconds that followed. The bartender yelled something. I couldn't make it out over the noise, and then began moving towards the end of the bar, intent on intervening. My heart pounded loud in my ears as I watched the scene unfold, feeling simultaneously detached and dangerously present. Every hair on my body stood on end as I watched the tall man wave the knife menacingly. His eyes were wild, unfocused. All the bravado from moments before had evaporated. He now looked more like a cornered animal than a threatening figure. The wiry man held up his hands, palms facing forward. Hey, let's just calm down. We don't need to do this. He tried to reason over the din, stepping back with caution. For a moment, a tense, breathless silence enveloped the scene. A vacuum where time seemed paralyzed. The noise of the bar faded to a muted background hum. I remember feeling both helpless and absurdly, acutely aware of my own breath, the basic act of inhaling and exhaling. Suddenly, as if on autopilot, Matt rose from his stool, instinctively stepping in the direction of the chaos. "What are you doing?" I hissed, grabbing his arm, a surge of fear lacing my voice. Matt shook his head. "I can't just stand by." As he moved forward, someone else was already there. The bartender had reached the tall man first. With surprising agility, he lunged, grabbing the man's arm and wrenching it upwards. The knife clattered to the floor, catching the light with a chilling gleam as it spun away, coming to rest several feet from where it had been dropped. The bar erupted into a series of shouts and gasps. People started moving, distancing themselves, yet craning their necks to see what was going on. The tension broke as a couple of other patrons rushed in, either to help if things went south or simply to witness the spectacle more closely. I could hear someone on their phone, presumably calling the police, as a couple of others joined the bartender in subduing the man. The wiry guy stepped back, looking visibly relieved yet distraught, understanding full well how close things had come to a point of no return. Matt returned to his seat next to me, a mix of adrenaline and relief on his face. "Holy shit," he whispered, running a hand through his hair. It seemed as though everyone was taking a collective breath, the danger having been averted. It wasn't long before the police arrived, blue and red lights flashing outside the bar window, cutting through the night. They quickly took the man into custody, the atmosphere gradually shifting from tense to one of cautious calm. As the situation unfolded, bits of the story reached us. The tall man had been heavily drunk, his mind clouded with alcohol-fueled paranoia. The argument had been over something trivial that only ballooned into the extreme due to their inebriated state. The night wore down after that. The bar staff tried to restore semblance to the chaos, offering free drinks to those who stayed and issuing apologies for the unexpected fright. Many patrons took the offer, using the time to decompress and talk through the insanity of what had almost happened. Matt and I just sat there, bewildered and shaken, trying to internalize the fact that we were mere feet away from something that could have ended tragically. Occasionally, we exchanged looks of disbelief as we sipped the beers that someone had slid in our direction. By the time we left O'Sullivan's, the air outside felt colder, sobering. We walked in silence for a while, each lost in our thoughts. It wasn't until we reached the corner, where we'd eventually part ways, that Matt spoke again. "You never think you're going to be that close to..." His voice trailed off, unable to find the right words. "I know," I responded quietly, nodding, just glad no one got hurt. We said our goodbyes, and as I headed home, the gravity of the night's events finally began to settle in. It was strange how life could veer so close to catastrophe in the blink of an eye. That knife, with its cold steel edge, had become a profound reminder of our fragile mortality. I lay awake for a long time that night, replaying the scene in my mind. The buzz cut, the flash of steel, and the collective gasp of those around us, all vivid, all haunting. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd come face to face with something dark and real, something that had irrevocably altered my sense of safety. As the days passed, life gradually returned to normal, but that night at O'Sullivan's stayed with me, a quiet reminder of the delicate balance between the everyday and the edge of chaos.